Hey everyone, welcome back. In the previous episode, we took a look at client credential flow and how our API 2 acts as a client requests an access token from IdenitiServer and then uses the access token to access some secret resource from API 1, which is an actual API. So just to clarify a few things before we get started and jump into this episode, if we go into API 2 and controllers and home controllers, if you are wondering why do we need this discovery document and use this token endpoint, since we can just use something like this address /auth/token endpoint, why do we need to grab this from the server? Well, the reason being is, let's say the domain of your server changes. That means you will have to rechange all of these strings that you have hard-coded. So getting the discovery document to sort of retrieve these endpoints for your server is the optimal way, right? So anytime you want to point to your identity server, you should always get the discovery document first. Otherwise, hard-coding strings is going to be a bad idea. And if you do have to change it in the future, you're not going to have a good time. And again, just a general reminder that IdenitityServer is a collection of tools that lay on top of Auth and OpenIdConnect. So when you're going to search for like IdenitiServer client ID or client secret explanations or scope explanations, you're not going to find them. And like if you're searching for IdenitiServer discovery document explanations, you might not find them because these implementation details are inside the specifications, which I'm going to leave a link for in descriptions, right? So the auth spec and the OpenID spec specify what has to be implemented. IdenitiServer is just an implementation and a collection of useful tools on top of that implementation. Okay, so enough with that. In this episode, we're going to take a look at authorization code flow. And if you've been sticking around for the previous episodes, this is essentially what we tried to achieve in auth here. So today we're just going to go ahead and set up a new client for this, and we're also going to create a new project. So let's first collapse these two APIs, and I'm going to close this home controller. Let's go ahead, copy this client, and let's put a new one down here. And I'm just going to prepend this with MVC because this is going to be an MVC client. Remember that if you have a JavaScript client, you actually don't have a backend through which you can use the authorization code to retrieve the access token from the identity server in the back channel, right? So that's implicit flow, and that is the more likelier scenario where you're going to be using this process of obtaining access tokens and using that. But for now, we're just building up to the knowledge of actually getting to implicit flow, and focusing on this, what we want to do is just set the client ID, client secret, and the grant types. So here how we have specified client credentials, we want to go ahead and set this to code. And here what we can actually do is just say API 1 and 2. So since in the previous episodes, in our startup here, we have set this API to actually be an API, right? So authorization here will point to IdenitiServer. So we can actually say, right, this client can access both the APIs, and this first client can just access API 1 because kind of accessing itself is a bit redundant. Okay, but one thing that we do, that we now have registered it, we actually need to tell IdenitiServer that this is one of the registered APIs, right? So we need to add another API resource into here. So once that's done, we then have to go and create this client, right? So it will be its own separate project. Okay, let's go into just a .NET Core application, and let's just say MVC client, and we're gonna do the bare bones setup as usual until it gets tiring. I don't think it will ever will, because it's so easy to get started from blank in .NET Core. So map default controller route. Okay, and in here we want to add services, controllers, and views, just like that. And the next thing I'm gonna add is the same thing that I've been adding in the basic and auth applications for my clients, is going to be use authentication and use authorization. Okay, and now what I want to do is I want to, similarly to how I set up my client in auth, I want to just add authentication. To here I will add cookie. I will, now that I'm using OpenIdConnect flow, I will have to use add OpenIdConnect extension, which again we will have to install a NuGet package for. So let's type it out, add OpenIdConnect, and we can just grab this, right click, manage NuGet packages, and then we'll just browse for add OpenIdConnect. And we want to grab this Microsoft ASP.NET Core Authentication OpenIdConnect package. And let's just install this. Let's accept. Okay, nice. Now if we close this and we put brackets here, the errors should go away. So if you remember how we configured it in auth here for our client in the startup, how we've set the cookie to sort of contain our tokens. Well, we want to do exactly the same, but now instead of just having an access token, we're also going to end up with an ID token, and we're going to take a look at it. So let's go into startup, and first things first is let's just name this cookie, and we're going to grab the config here, and whoa, skip the bracket there for some reason. Cool. So if we go into config and we just set the default skim to be cookie, it's going to set everything across the board to use cookie, and then we can go ahead and grab the default challenge scheme to be OIDC, which is what we're going to set this part to, right? So across the board, cookie is the default one, and then we just override one parameter, which is when we're going to be challenged for authorization to check if we're allowed to access something. So let's go ahead and specify the config here, and the configuration is going to be something similar to how we do it here, except a little bit less verbose for now. So what we can do is we can grab the client ID and client secret and just paste these here, and we will prepend them with MVC and MVC here. So at this point we're effectively identifying our client. Next thing that we can grab is the save tokens parameter, right? So we're essentially telling it, right, save tokens in our cookies. Next thing that we want is to specify the authority. So if we go into API 2 or API 1 startup, we can grab the authority from here and throw it in here as well. And remember, because it's OpenIdConnect, this middleware is going to know how to retrieve the discovery document, and it's going to know basically how to communicate through that background process. Okay, so another thing that we will need with OpenIdConnect is the actual flow that it's going to use on this OpenIdConnect client, right? Because this client is going to define how it's going to try to retrieve the access token, and OpenIdConnect specifies a couple of flows. In our auth example, we were just by default using auth. So let's go close that, and I'm going to open up this specification, and we're just going to glance over what flows are available to us, right? So if you go to section 3, authentication of this document, again, a link is going to be in the description. We have authorization code flow, which is what we're going to be using now. And there's also implicit flow and hybrid flow. And if we scroll down, these are essentially the response types. Okay, so if we go back to the project and we look at our server in auth controller, remember that the response type is not to be confused with grant type, right? So grant type is a flow of access token request, and response type is authorization flow type, or maybe rather actually authentication. But doesn't matter too much, because essentially what response types will specify is which flow are you going to essentially pick, right? And what code means is that we're going to get an authorization code back, which we can then exchange for ID token and token. Implicit flow, you don't get the code, you either get the ID token or ID token and the access token back. And then hybrid flow is a combination of these two, and that's why there are 3 options. If there is no just code for hybrid flow, because if it's just code, it's going to be authorization code flow. So this is why when you go with hybrid flow, you get the code, the ID token, you get the code and an access token, and then the code can then again be exchanged for an access token and an ID token. And hybrid flow, we're not going to touch on it too much in this series, this is probably going to be the only mention. I might show you how to implement it. But to get this out of the way right now, hybrid flow is almost never used. I heard the only application for hybrid flow is when you're implementing banking systems, and rolling your own authentication there is like requires top professional university graduates that still have energy to code, right? So you primarily never gonna end up using hybrid flow. So this series we're focusing on authorization code flow. So coming back to why we're even looking at this specification here is our client needs to basically say, right, which of these am I going to use? And our goal is to use this code response type. So let's go back to our project, into startup, and in config here, we can set the response type, and we can just say code here. Okay, and essentially when then you get challenged because the setup to these endpoints is discovered through the discovery document, it's automatically going to pass the response type to this authorization endpoint, and then you're just going to end up at the login screen, and it's going to basically do all the hard parts for you, right? All you have to do is just implement the UI elements, etc. Okay, so at this point, we have a MVC client, which is pointing to our identity server, and it knows how it's going to retrieve its access token, or it's basically its authentication flow and its access token and ID token retrieval. We're going to save it in the cookie. We know what client it is, and we know where we're pointing it to. And remember, the discovery document is going to be discovered by this automatically. And we can always install the identity model package to get those sweet extensions on the HTTP client. Now at this point, again, you just want to do the bare minimum, and you just want to be able to log in and authenticate, right? So let's go ahead and set up a controllers folder, and let's create a home controller.cs. Let's create a public, and let's first actually inherit from controller, iaction result, index. Right, so this is just the home page that I want to hit and return view. I'm just going to return this home page. And the next thing I want is to access a secret resource, right? So this is one I want to authorize an endpoint. I'm going to call it secret. So the point here that this will require this cookie to be dealt out to reach. And the access token that we're going to have inside the cookie is going to be used to access these two resources. Okay, and same as in the previous example that I showed you here, the claims can be retrieved, and because we're now using IdenitityServer, it's going to do a bit of heavy lifting for us, and I'm going to show you what we essentially get with IdenitityServer. So let's go ahead and set up the pages for this. So views, home, index.cs HTML. I'm going to copy this, comma, and let's say secret CSHTML. Okay, so there's our two pages. Let's call one homepage. I'll copy this line, and here I'll say secret page. Okay, and on the homepage, would I like a redirect? Not really. I'm just gonna go ahead and use the URL, and once I try to hit this page, it's gonna try to redirect me to IdenitityServer, right? So at this point, let's go ahead and just run this, and we'll just see what we're either missing or if it's actually working now, and what else do we need. So for now, I want to, where is it? I want to just go into properties, right? And I want to start up this MVC client as well. So let's go ahead and set it to start, right? So this will get a little bit messy. We now have 4 projects running side by side. One thing I will do in this home controller is I will set this to, let's say, home/index, or maybe, yeah, let's just do /home first, because I don't want this to trigger every single time, and we'll keep the breakpoint here. Okay, so let's start this. So at this point, the goal is to just hit the secret endpoint and try to get redirected to IdenitityServer to log in. Okay, so where is my homepage? There we go. So homepage /home/ secret. Okay, so that was a little bit too fast for the human eye. So let's go back. You will see the port change, but I will go ahead, open up my console, and this is one way that you can sort of track what is happening, right? So make sure you have preserved log enabled, or in network as well preserve log, and this is where we'll be able to track the redirects, right? So home/secret, and this is where we're navigated to a completely different site, and we're hitting an error endpoint, right? So one way that we can inspect this error is in the output window, and if we grab the IdenitityServer tab, so IdenitityServer has been a core web app, and if we expand this a little bit, what we want to do is we want to find something like fail, fail, fail. All the errors that you get with IdenitityServer are all described in the specifications, okay? So let's say invalid client configuration for client ID MVC, no redirect URI configured. So essentially, when reaching these kind of errors, if we go into the specification and if we drop back to the top and we look at authorization code part, we want to find essentially the part where we are trying to make the authentication request. Okay, and all the information that we're going to read here is essentially what IdenitityServer is implementing. So we are trying to authenticate. So let's go ahead and look in this section, and let's look for something that basically says redirect URI. Okay, and this is something that's required. The thing with IdenitityServer and OpenIdConnect middlewares that we have implemented, so they are bordering. What we have received in this output here for this redirect URI is the default for OpenIdConnect middleware, and IdenitityServer really doesn't know anything about it. So what we want to do is we just want to grab this and put it in the configuration here. So we can go ahead and specify the redirect URIs. Okay, so let's go ahead and stop it, and we'll rerun, but with the redirect URI present now, and let's see what happens. So again, we're at the home page. Let's go ahead and open the console, and I'm expecting to maybe see another error. Okay, so we are redirected to the error page again. So again, what we'll do is we'll go to the output window, and it's important to know this stuff because you are going to run in a lot of errors with IdenitityServer. So I want to show you how to sort of go about discovering what's actually wrong and debugging that, right? So again, we're going to go into the IdenitiServer logs, and we're going to scroll to the bottom because that's the last thing that happened. And let's take a look at the fail. Invalid scope, OpenID. Okay, so here's one thing that I haven't discussed, or I don't think I have mentioned it. There are essentially two different type of scopes. One comes in the form of sort of resource endpoints, so like APIs can be a resource that you're trying to access, and a second resource is stuff like your claims. So if you're asking for an email or a telephone number or a picture URL, that is also a scope, and you have to request for it. And the thing with OpenIdConnect is, again, if we look into the spec, it all makes sense. This is just how it's designed. If we look in the scope, it says required. OpenIdConnect request must contain the OpenID scope value. All right. So essentially what it's doing is, if we go into the client startup, not into here, sorry. Let's say into auth controller. The OpenIdConnect middleware automatically populates this value with OpenID scope value, and this is something that we have to configure IdenitityServer to actually have. Okay, so the way we would configure this is, first of all, we need to, same as we sort of register our API scopes, which are resources, we want to register kind of the scopes that can belong to a user, right? So all we're doing is actually dealing with information access, right? So there is user information, and then there is kind of a resource information that the user is trying to access. It can be a little bit hard to wrap your head around it, but you will get there over time with practice. So what we want to do here is to define kind of what information can be requested in scopes, okay, alongside the scopes that can be specified here in terms of API resource access. Okay, so let's go ahead and type in identity resource. This is the object that's used to model this, and there are some identity resources that are predefined. So let's go ahead and call this get identity resources, and same as before, we're just going to create a list, and we're going to call this identity resource. Let's go ahead and specify a new identity resources. So kind of the same how we have grant types, and we can grab a grant type. We can call new identity resources, and we can create an OpenID resource, right? And let me just remove this. And if you've seen, there are a couple of more, like email, address, phone, profile. If we go into the OpenIdConnect spec, scroll to the top, and essentially what you can do is search for something like scopes. And that was a little bit too far. I wanted to, let's say, scope. There we go, somewhere there. Request claims using scope values. So we go here, right? These are some of the well-known claims, something that the spec has defined. So that's what IdenitityServer has provided you from the start. You can create your own scope. All right, so that doesn't stop you from it, but that's essentially it, right? So another thing that the OpenID middleware is, it's going to by default basically ask you for a profile spec, right? So it's optional in the OpenIdConnect spec, but for some reason this OpenIdConnect middleware that Microsoft has made makes it required, or essentially is making it required, right? So we're actually going to see this. So we will need to essentially add this line here. But just so you know what the error looks like when you have some kind of invalid scopes requested or stuff like that, we're going to go ahead and actually see this. So again, I'm going to start up the application. And again, let's go to home/scope. Oh, scope. Talking about scope too much. Secret. And spell it correctly. Okay, and we are hitting an error again. So as I mentioned before, again, we go into output, identity server, scroll to the bottom, and we still get OpenID scope. Okay, so we have haven't actually talking too much. I've missed out a few steps. So we just defined a list here, so we haven't actually registered with our identity server. Okay, so let me actually drop down this auth thing. It seems to be in the way. So for our identity server, same thing, and as we have registered our API resources, we want to register possible identity resources, right? So let's add in memory identity resources, and let's get identity resources. Now that we have specified that these are the possible identity resources that you could get, and by the way, if you would want to add email, you add it to this list. Otherwise, your clients cannot request this scope. So again, because we have specified OpenID here, we now have to tell this client that he's actually allowed this scope, okay? So let's go ahead and type in OpenID. And rather than typing it out, and by the way, you can just go ahead into here and OpenID, grab it and paste it here. What you can do is obviously IdentityServer4 IdenitityServer constants, that's the one. And in here we want to find scopes, standard scopes, and yeah, OpenIdConnect, right? So let's delete this, import this. So this is essentially just that static or a constant value. So if we go here, we will see it just says OpenIdConnect, right? So this is just a bunch of stuff that you can go ahead and use. So we have specified OpenID for our client, and we have registered OpenID as a resource that can be accessed, and we have actually registered it in our startup with our identity server. Cool. Let's go again. So again, home/scope, secret, we get an error, and that is fine. We go to output, and we want to actually find IdenitityServer again, scroll to the bottom, and now we get an invalid scope profile. And again, this is the part where I mentioned where in our startup, this middleware adds the profile scope automatically, so it adds OpenID and profile scope. The creators of IdenitityServer have complained about this. Multiple people have complained about this. Nothing's been done. So what you have to do is you just gotta enable the profile scope by default. It might not mean much to you if you're starting out, but this bloats the access token with all kinds of information. Well, not just access token, the ID token as well. So your cookie essentially becomes heavier, etc. Right? So add profile here, and now what we have to do is add profile here as well. So our client is allowed this scope, and we can go ahead and register it with our identity server. So, and this is what it's going to request by default. This middleware, these are the scopes that it's requesting by default, right? So again, if we just look at the specification, just so you know where it sort of ends up and how it looks like. If we go to authorization code flow, authorization endpoint, and we take a look at an example perhaps of a request, okay, so here it is. You would see something like this, right? So this is where you're already redirected to the server, and the scope will denote a list of just space separated OpenID, which is required to retrieve an ID token, which is going to be your user information, stuff like your user ID. And then there's going to be the profile as well, which is really just required by the middleware, right? So these are the only two scopes that we're going to have in the URL that's passed around. Okay, so let's go ahead, start this up, and see what happens. Okay, so again, home/secret. Okay, and now we are at /account/login, and the situation should be familiar at this point. At this point, all we have to do is implement the identity parts, or sort of tell it where to actually log in. So at this point, I'm going to stop the episode because the next part is going to be sort of infusing identity with IdentityServer4, and it might get confusing. But again, just to give you an overview, what we have done is we have gone ahead and created a new client with a new project for the MVC client. And what we have done is made the client go to IdentityServer with the URL to come back to the MVC client. But what it's going to do on the IdentityServer is authenticate. So we're just going to set up that functionality in the next episode. But primarily what we have looked at in this episode is looking at some scopes that are needed by OpenID itself and by this IdentityConnect middleware, and looking at the errors that can be caused by missing scopes. And again, just to remind you that if you're facing errors, you want to look up error codes in this specification. You don't want to primarily go to Stack Overflow. Look in this document for descriptions of what might be wrong. Yeah, this will be it for this episode. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, leave a like, subscribe. If you thought this episode was too short, leave a comment, because I thought this was a nice part where to cut the episode. If you would have preferred for this episode to include the setup of identity, please say so, because I know this can be a hard topic and I don't want these episodes to be too overwhelming. But as always, have a good day and see you in my other videos.